A Spider-Man that walks around with a knife ready to stab a witch. A Spider-Man that daydreams of killing everybody in his path when he's dealing with a traffic jam. A Spider-Man that rarely wears his suit, but who comes across a surprising amount of women being attacked. Well, we're talking today about the 1970 Spider-Man manga. It is a very grim take on Spider-Man, very different than anything else you've ever come across, but it gives us a fascinating look at 1970s manga, how it was evolving, and how the influences of Japanese society in 1970 shaped a very, very different Spider-Man. Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Folks, the world is more connected than ever before, and it's normal these days for stories to cross national borders and be reinterpreted in other countries. For instance, there's now manga about Deadpool. There's manga where Superman takes lunch breaks to fly over to Japan and try new meals. There's manga where Dr. Octopus gets reborn as an awkward teenage girl. But it all had to start somewhere. In 1970, Marvel tried to break into the manga market with a Spider-Man manga. It only lasted from 1970 to 1971. It is a very dark story, very grim, very different than what we recognize as Spider-Man today. Ultimately, it failed to capture its audience. It was eventually translated into English in the late 90s, brought to America, and also kind of failed. So it's an interesting story, I think. We're going to take a look at who the creators were that made this manga. We're going to take a look at the stories themselves and how they differ from what we recognize here in the West as Spider-Man. And we're going to talk about why it didn't really capture an audience either time. There's a lot to talk about. I hope you'll stay with me. Before we start, I also want to plug something for myself. In March, Issue 32 of Radiant Black comes out, and folks, I've got a small backup in the back that I wrote and illustrated. It would mean a lot to me if you supported me by asking your comic book store to order you a copy of Radiant Black number 32. Thanks for listening to that. Let's get on with the Spider-Man manga story. If you read the editorial in the American reprint of Spider-Man Manga Issue 1 by editor Tom Brevoort, it seems to vaguely imply that Marvel had an employee named Gene Pelk that negotiated the manga deal. It includes several paragraphs of Pelk explaining the challenge of bringing Spider-Man to Japan, and that was taken from Marvel's Friends of Old Marvel magazine, Issue 22 from 1978. However, this is a bit misleading. Gene Pelk began working for Marvel's parent company Cadence in 1976, over 5 years after the manga ended. Pelk arranged the deal for the Spider-Man live-action TV show. In fact, the idea to adapt Spider-Man to manga came from Japan. Masaru Uchida was the third editor-in-chief of the publisher Kodansha's manga magazine called Weekly Shonen Magazine, beginning at just age 30. Under his leadership, the magazine went from a distribution of 300,000 copies to 1.5 million over a 5-year period. He did this by hiring the best talent out there and developing hit ideas. He worked with Golgo 13 creator Takeo Sato and horror genius Kazuo Umezo on the Ultraman manga while the show was just beginning. He gave opportunities to Leiji Matsumoto, Go Nagai, and cultivated hit manga like Tiger Mask and Tomorrow's Joe. Perhaps most importantly, he developed Gigigi no Kitaro with Shigeru Mizuki, who is probably the second most influential manga creator after Osamu Tezuka. Uchida had an eye for talent, and he was also up to date on the trends in manga, including the late 1960s boom of Gekiga, or manga that was aimed at more mature audiences. According to writer and translator Kosei Ono, Uchida had followed Ono's column in Calm magazine, called Introduction to Overseas Manga. And Uchida was interested in the colorful superheroes from America. Uchida had recently been given control of the spin-off publication to Weekly Shonen magazine called Monthly Special Issue Shonen Magazine, and the goal was to make it larger.
Now that's thick!
Which would justify having color pages added to the typically black and white magazine. To that end, Mr. Uchida was especially interested in Spider-Man because he was a teenager with problems, and Uchida thought that would resonate with Japanese readers. Ono has an essay about this in the Tankobon reprints of the manga, and allowed the Comics Journal to translate it into English in 2022. Ono states that Mr. Uchida, quote, felt that they could not simply take this foreigner comics character and put him out there just like that for the Japanese version. Mr. Uchida had made up his mind and was thinking that he wanted to totally make the setting in Japan and even take its protagonist and make him into a Japanese person, end quote. Uchida had Ono translate a bunch of the American Spider-Man comics so that they could understand the character. Uchida also hired Ryoichi Ikegami to create the stories and art based on the art that he'd done in the past of moody teenagers in recent issues of Garo magazine. Ikegami was a young artist who had apprenticed under Shigeru Mizuki, and he was just starting out. He would go on to create one of the first manga that was translated into English, Mai the Psychic Girl, and he became famous for his manga like Crying Freeman. That was a collaboration with writer Kazuo Koike, writer of the famous Lone Wolf and Cub series. Crying Freeman became an influential manga set in the criminal world of the Yakuza, and Ikegami followed it up with two more crime mangas, Heat and Sanctuary, both with writer Bronson, well known here for Fist of the North Star. But in 1970, Ikegami was still developing his own style and drawing what was popular at the time: realistic and detailed backgrounds, cinematic pacing, and relatively cartoony characters. In 2023, Ryoichi Ikegami was a guest at France's Angoulême Comics Festival, and he was asked about making the Spider-Man manga on a panel. Ikegami said, quote, "In the beginning, I didn't want to make Spider-Man because, for me, who drew in Garo, those superheroes with their big hearts weren't inspiring to me. I found that forced, unrealistic, and not interesting, because the real world was hard. I wasn't a fan of those stories with the big villain losing at the end and all the good guys saved at the end, which is reality's exact opposite. We can work hard and give everything we have, we won't necessarily make it. Therefore, I started turning down that offer. But the publisher put himself next to me and tapped me on the shoulder saying that I was wrong because Spider-Man wasn't at all what I imagined, and that, on the contrary, he was a hero full of concerns and anxieties. That's why he was asking me to do this job, because I was able to draw that more nuanced type of hero. And it convinced me to make Spider-Man. I don't regret it at all. I liked it. My version of Spider-Man was often really dark." The manga would run from January of 1970 through September of 1978, and the chapters are about 100 pages long. 100 pages a month. Crazy to think about. Anyway, there were 13 stories, and I'm going to give you the gist of them so that we have a basis to talk about what's different and just how crazy the stories are. Chapter 1 is appropriately titled The Birth of Spider-Man and introduces us to our protagonist, a high school student named Yu Komori, who lives in Tokyo, Japan. It is not Peter Parker, and personally, I wonder if the name Komori was chosen because the Japanese word for spider is kumo, which sounds a bit similar? Who knows? Yu is performing science experiments himself instead of going to a science fair, and I guess his public school just lets him play with radiation. He is bitten by a spider and soon discovers he has immense strength and the ability to stick to walls. Yu immediately makes some web shooters and thinks to himself that he's not Superman, but that he'll make a suit. Yu has a much smaller supporting cast than the American Spider-Man, which includes an aunt that doesn't really do much. We'll soon see Electro, who calls himself Electro the Electric Man, wearing the same suit as the American version, and robbing a bank thanks to his ability to shoot lightning. For some reason, one guy in the crowd assumes he's a cyborg. And that may in fact be his origin, because we later learn that Electro had injured a kid and wasn't able to pay for it, so he let the kid's parent, a professor of electronics, experiment on him so that they could rob banks. Next, we meet Yu's love interest, a pen pal from Hokkaido in the north who has come to visit for the first time. She's specifically come looking for her missing older brother. Pen pals. I'm not sure if that's too dated for everybody to know what I'm talking about, but it's when you would write letters back and forth to a friend, sometimes people that you'd never even met in person. Keep in mind, this was 1970, so basically it's the modern equivalent of social media. There is a local newspaper in this story with an unnamed editor that sort of looks like J. Jonah Jameson. In an attempt to drum up business for the newspaper, they put up a 10 million yen reward to capture Electro. If we adjust for inflation and convert to US dollars, we're talking about $235,000. I don't know. What do you think? Would you go up against a supervillain that could shoot lightning if you could capture him, you know, get that $235,000? Is that worth it? That's a puzzler. Electro next robs a women's clothing store because that's the natural next step up after robbing a bank. Spider-Man confronts him and he kills him with one punch. From then on, Yu is very scared of his powers. Oh, and Electro turns out to be Rumi's brother, so now Rumi hates Spider-Man. The second story is called The Transformation of Dr. Inumaru. We get our second classic Spidey villain, the Lizard. Here, he's destroying a pharmaceutical company. We also get a glimpse of the pressures on Japanese teenagers at the time, as Yu visits his friend Araki, and Araki's father slaps him in the face for listening to music with Yu instead of studying. There are some unique layouts, and the art here is generally what was popular at the time. The backgrounds and the cars, stuff like that, is just gorgeous. We would probably consider the characters very cartoony compared to what we're used to reading today, but that was just what was popular at the time. Kazuo Umezu's The Drifting Classroom is an influential horror book aimed at older readers and has a similar style. That was coming out around the same time. Go Nagai's Devilman was very mature with a lot of sex and violence, but simple main character design. Barefoot Gen is another example of a popular manga that came out at the time. That's by Keiji Nakazawa, and it has similar art. And that is covering something very serious, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. I'd argue Lone Wolf and Cub by Kazuo Koike and Goseki Kojima is an early example of less cartoony, more detailed characters, and that debuted the same year as the Spider-Man manga. The Lizard in this version of the manga is wildly different than the tragic doctor in Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's Spider-Man. Rather than experimenting on himself to regrow a lost limb, this is a pharmacy doctor who was left in a wild land, and he says that as he fought for his life each day, one day he just evolved into a lizard man. And he turns into this creature when his emotions are heightened. Like Electro, he ends up dying. Story 3 is called Too Strong a Hero and uses another supervillain from the original comics, but a much more obscure one. Anyone remember the Kangaroo? Well, in this version, he's a pro wrestler who is from Australia, and he says that he grew up around the kangaroos, so one day he realized he could just jump even higher than them. Almost the same story as the Lizard. Once again, Yu Komori just happens upon the villain. Although, in a decent twist, he attacks a group of pro wrestlers fighting Kangaroo, assuming that they're ganging up on an innocent man. This story is the last significant appearance of the newspaper editor, who has a quick cameo saying that he's mad at Spider-Man because Spider-Man actually claimed that 1 million yen reward from the first story. In a second coincidence, a friend of Yu's is in a car accident, and while at the hospital, Yu hears that the kangaroo stole some deadly bacteria when hoping to rob a bank truck. Spider-Man tracks him down, and Kangaroo argues it's not his fault he was born so strong. But he's a hypocrite. Kangaroo has hurt people and he's stolen a weapon. So Spider-Man webs him up. And then Yukimori gets so frustrated with being Spider-Man that he throws his suit in the river and rarely wears it moving forward. The manga is clearly a very different take on Spider-Man, and a big part of that is, in the American Spider-Man comics, there's an Uncle Ben who teaches Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Yukimori doesn't have that uncle, and he's got a much different set of motivations. Instead, he's very scared of how powerful he is. He's scared that he could accidentally kill or at least hurt people. And what that ends up being in practice is there's a lot of stories where Yukimori just lets himself get beaten up by people because he's afraid if he fights back he might kill them. He views his abilities as a curse. Story 4 is the last story with a supervillain. It's called The False Spider-Man. It's twice as long as the previous stories. It begins with Spider-Man killing a popular actor, and for the rest of the series, the public think that Spider-Man is a villain. Rumi visits again after being absent for the last chapter. The aunt almost gets a story when she sees that Yu has notes on Spider-Man. We see that she's concerned, and I wondered, does she think that Yu is Spider-Man? But Yu comes home and the aunt instantly says, not that she suspected that he was Spider-Man, but for a moment she thought that he idolized a criminal, but then just instantly waves it away saying it's a silly idea. She never factors into the stories in a significant way again. There's some cool art, detailed cities, or Yu's surreal dream where he imagines himself as a monster chasing Rumi, who fears Spider-Man because he killed her brother. We also get a scene where Yu lets himself get beaten up by thugs, fearing he could hurt them. The fake Spider-Man steals Rumi's purse from her, which had photos of her late brother and mother, and this is what actually makes Yu vow to stop him. He didn't care about having his name ruined, but he draws the line at having an imposter upsetting Rumi. Yu, as Spider-Man, encounters a new hero that has announced himself to the public, Mysterio. I have no idea when Yu made himself a new Spider-Man suit. Mysterio can melt Spider-Man's webbing. Spider-Man chases him and he ends up knocking over a kid in the crowd. So he rushes the kid to the hospital and all the onlookers think that Spider-Man is kidnapping the boy. When he gets to the hospital, the doctors tell Spider-Man that they are going to need 5,000 yen to operate or the kid will go blind. Just from getting knocked down? Yu becomes a stuntman to earn money and meets a friendly stuntman named Kitagawa. When Yu goes to the hospital to pay for the operation, Ryoichi Ikegami has one amazingly cool way of presenting Spider-Man from time to time, starting here, with Spider-Man appearing to walk in the air above everyone else. He's actually walking on a nearly invisible strand of his webbing, but it's surreal and cool, and I'm surprised the American comics have never tried to take that idea. Mysterio emerges, and it leads to a fight on top of a train. When Mysterio is eventually unmasked, turns out that it's Kitagawa, who was jealous of actors, and he killed the actor at the beginning. Spider-Man then curses his life, and once again vows to quit. The fifth story is the first without a supervillain. It's called Yu Under Suspicion. It begins with a woman being attacked and about to be molested. I'm being careful with my word choice on YouTube. Yu intervenes as himself, and he fights off the attackers. But in the confusion, the girl assumes Yu is her attacker, and she's a classmate. There's some great hints at what Ikegami's art will eventually evolve into as he draws some really detailed and soulful eyes on Yu. There's also cool little ideas like Spider-Man resting on a webbing hammock at home. Yu knows that the attackers are all members of the high school kendo club. They're well respected, so he decides that no one would believe him if he proclaimed his innocence. And Yu just lets the teachers think he tried to attack his classmate, and for the rest of the manga, he is hated and thought of as a pervert. Yukimori never tries to clear his name, and I find that utterly baffling. I don't know whether it's just some sort of cultural aspect to the story that I don't comprehend, or if Ikigami just didn't think it was important enough to resolve. Either way, all I can say is that it adds to the misery that Yu Komori has, and adds to the depressing nature of this Spider-Man manga. Yu joins the Kendo Club to get close to the villains of the story, and we see the first of an ongoing stylistic idea that Ikigami introduces, where Yu Komori thinks about what to do, and there's tons of Spider-Man faces floating in the background. It's a different take on how Steve Ditko would draw Peter Parker with a half Spider-Man mask. We also get another scene of Yu allowing people to beat him up, this time by the older brother of his classmate and the guy's friends. Yu learns that Rumi is now working at a sleazy go-go club downtown. Ultimately, the Kendo Club tries to kill Yu out in the fields, but he just beats them up. Yu's friend Araki overhears them admit that they are the criminals, and he begs Yu to let him tell the school the truth. But Yu just walks away, and neither of them ever talk about it again.
Misery, misery, misery. That's what you've chosen.
The sixth story is called The Summer of Insanity. Yu and Araki and some classmates are going for a drive, and they're caught in awful traffic. For several pages, Yu daydreams of smashing the cars with his power and terrifying everyone. The friends encounter a biker who tries to shoot them and who then speeds away. The school kids drive past several deadly car accidents, and eventually they stop at a bar. There, they see the biker again, and he grabs one of the girls from the group to dance. A cop enters the bar, and the biker shoots him dead and takes the group hostage. The biker kills more police that pursue them. If you're wondering why Yu hasn't tried to use his abilities to stop this guy, I kind of wonder the same thing. All I can figure is that he does have a gun to the head of his classmates, and I guess Yu is just worried about them getting hurt. Eventually, the biker and the classmates all get on board a plane at the airport. We don't see how, but back then, there sincerely weren't metal detectors, so I guess he just might have held one of the girls at gunpoint under his jacket or something. Eventually, he shoots a passenger on the plane, and the bullet also causes the plane to lose power and lights. Yu confronts the crazy biker, and we find out that this version of Spider-Man is bulletproof. Wow, he is powerful. Yu knocks the man out and sneaks out onto the wing of the plane to force a flap up and allow it to land safely. A quick epilogue reveals that the biker was a US soldier who had seen horrible things in Vietnam and then transferred to a base on Japan, and one day he just snapped and went on this killing spree. The final tankobon volume that collects this manga includes an interview with Ikigami where he talks about this story. He said, quote, "It was a time back then when there was a lot of anti-war sentiment as expressed in folk songs that were popular with young people. Even somebody like myself was listening to Bob Dylan. It was also a time when people were talking passionately about the movies like Easy Rider and Bonnie and Clyde, which had that anti-establishment and fallen world vibes to them. When I was working on the series, we just naturally absorbed those sentiments from such a cultural environment as if breathing the air." Speaking more about this story, Ikigami said that he always had an anti-authoritarian streak and said, quote, "Actually, now I remember something. It was just some time after I had been paired up with Hirai sensei. There was the Setochi seajacking incident. We saw that the police shot and killed the hijacker on television. I said to Hirai sensei, 'If I die, I want to die beautifully like that.' And then Hirai sensei disagreed and told me, 'Ikigami-san, death is never pretty.' So again, I cared less about the incident and more for the assassinated hijacker, sympathizing with something like that anti-authoritarian part of the criminal. I say this because I believe I shared the concerns that Spider-Man had for the socially vulnerable, or the worries that Spider-Man carried. His constant dilemma of wanting to protect others, but never being able to fully protect them. Those worries of Komori Yu, the protagonist of my Spider-Man, were very much the worries of my own at that time in my life. Because I was hanging on to something like a lack of faith in adults, not trusting them for all their hypocrisy and deceit. I think that is what comes out." I don't love how many of these stories have you coincidentally coming across a criminal, like this one. But I do like this story a lot in that it really shows us a lot of the cultural fears and concerns at the time. You know, there were concerns about what was going to happen with the Vietnam War. There was concern over violent crime embodied here with a man with a gun. And there's some interesting scenes where Yu thinks to himself how a man with a gun is just as dangerous as him with his super strength. For Chapter 7, titled What is My Destination, Ikegami starts the story with Yu daydreaming about Rumi, and eventually he just starts jerking off and imagines stealing Rumi's clothes.
No, God! No, God, please, no! No! No!
At school, a girl bumps into Yu and is scared of him because of his reputation. Yu ends up befriending a cool classmate named Inumaru. They go into the city together, but there's a moment where Yu is alone and some thugs bump into him and beat him up. Once again, he refuses to fight back, but Inumaru returns and stops them. Turns out they work for him somehow. Inumaru scolds his men and takes Yu up to his apartment, gives him a cool new set of clothes and some money, acting like it's no big deal. Yu checks in on Rumi at her club, but her boss is taking her out on a date. In the car, we realize that Rumi was just asking him to pretend to be her date so that she could let Yu down, feeling that she is now no good for him. Yu then begins hallucinating and eventually finds himself in Inumaru's apartment with some strangers that tell Yu he was on a marijuana trip. That's not really how that works, but then again, around the same time in the American comics, Peter Parker's roommate Harry Osborn started tripping out over some ill-defined pills, so maybe this part is actually a pretty accurate adaptation of the American comics. Some of Inumaru's men force a girl into a bedroom, and they're ready to assault her. Yu is incredibly indecisive, but over 10 pages later, he finally interrupts just in time. A girl named Chico explains to Yu that Inumaru is a drug dealer. In fact, some men corner Inumaru when he's alone to rob him and attack him, and Inumaru kills one of them with his pistol in self-defense. Inumaru's boss refuses to help him, cuts him loose. Yu tries to catch up and help Inumaru, but in a surreal art sequence, we see the road from Inumaru's perspective as he tries to drive away. Dialogue tells us that the police shoot and Inumaru crashes the car and dies. The stories will only get more grim and supernatural from here on out. Writer Kazumasa Hirai took over writing the stories. Ikegami has said in interviews that he was having trouble coming up with the stories, and Hirai was a famous sci-fi author who had created Japan's first cyborg hero, Atoman, back in 1963, alongside artist Jiro Kuwata. In the Ikegami interview in the back of the manga, he says, quote, "Once I tried my original stories, the series' popularity began to catch on. We ended up asking sci-fi writer Hirai Kazumasa Sensei to join in as the scriptwriter. The first story we did together was Winter Witch. This story was just fantastic, and it was popular with the readers. The story in question is also known as The Woman of Winter, and it begins with Yu Komori sensing danger in public, and everything begins to freeze. Things go back to normal, but Yu notices that there are some ice crystals in the air, so it really happened. We see some accidents happen around the city where people die, and there's always a woman in black walking around those mysterious circumstances. Yu is actually very proactive in this story, and he does some research and interviews, eventually learning that there was a jilted woman who a reporter was abusive to. She gained the sad supernatural ability to cause people around her to die in accidents. Yu suits up as Spider-Man and actually stalks her with a knife, with the intention of potentially killing her to protect people, but she ends up jumping in front of a train to end her life. The 9th story is called Strangers, and is a pretty simple story where Yu and a random girl are kidnapped, along with a high-level police official. The abductors are student radicals that want to force the police chief to request some Communist Party members are released from prison. Once again, we get a scene of a girl being stripped, and Yu allows some criminals to beat up on him. The police refuse to release the prisoners, and Yu has another scene of thinking about what to do with a bunch of Spider-Man heads in the background. He finds an opportunity when it's just the girl and himself alone to snap his restraints and runs through the decrepit house that they were held in. A gang member shoots the girl in the arm and she passes out. Yu dresses up in Spider-Man gear and quickly defeats the criminals. Then he just walks away from both the criminals and the victims. I think this one had an interesting idea, but with a pretty flat ending. Once again, Yu Komori kind of sits around not knowing what to do. When he finally makes up his mind, he very quickly takes out the criminals, but then he just sort of walks away from everything, and it just ends very abruptly. I mean, I think it's safe to assume that everybody got help, but it adds to the nature of this being a very grim story. Chapter 10 is a strange one. It's called The Mania Demon, and it begins with some men in a car about to assault Rumi. I guess maybe they abducted her from the Go-Go Club. Then a crazy driver forces them all to crash, and we cut to the hospital. Rumi is the only survivor and is seriously injured. Yu and his aunt check on her, and the police share that there is a crazy driver forcing people to crash at high speeds. And then Rumi just dies. It's certainly tragic. It's certainly a surprise. But I'd argue it does not carry the same weight as, say, the original Spider-Man comics where Gwen Stacy dies. In that, a villain kills Gwen to hurt Spider-Man. It's a very personal connection there. But in this, Rumi is just a random victim. It makes the world just seem very bleak and nihilistic. Yu gets approved to be part of a patrol looking for the crazy driver, and he takes some motorcycle classes. His teacher, Taki Shogo, is skilled and seems kind. Soon enough, Yu is zipping around the city on a bike as Spider-Man and quickly comes across the driver. He jumps in the car and learns that the killer gets a thrill from driving at high speeds. It probably isn't a surprise to learn that the driver is Taki, the only other character in the story. Taki is ready to kill them both in a fiery crash, but Yu grabs the wheel to stop things. Unfortunately, Taki is then shot in the face by police from a patrol helicopter, and the story ends very quickly. This story was skipped when the manga was translated into English in the monthly Marvel run from the 1990s. Chapter 11 is about twice the size of the other chapters and gets back to Spider-Man fighting a villain. It's an original one. The story begins with a man in a serious condition at the hospital after a train wreck. Yu volunteers to donate blood because he shares the same blood type, AB. A new potential love interest, Yukiko Kitano, thanks Yu for saving her brother's life. This has some really cool art hinting at where Ikigami's interests will soon take him. Mitsuo also thanks Yu and begins calling him his brother. Mitsuo soon develops the same Spider-Man powers, and Yu gets some weird feelings, a weird premonition. Now we cut to a burglar stealing from skyscrapers, and we encounter one such event. Some guards try to stop the burglar, and he hurls a baton at one of them with so much force that it knocks the man's eyeballs out. This is one example of where the Marvel adaptation edited the art to tone things down, but it hilariously still says the man will go blind. Yeah, because he had his eyeballs knocked out of his skull. There's more of that beautiful Ikigami imagery of Spider-Man walking through the city sky at night. There's a fight, but Yu knows who it is, and he decides to let Mitsuo go, hoping that he'll change. However, a fake Spider-Man instantly emerges, and he begins getting on the news for attacking the buildings of big polluters. Yu vows to stop this, and they have a face-off on Spider String high above everyone else. There is a fight, but all of a sudden, Mitsuo begins aging rapidly. The blood transfusion has worn off, and he ends up falling to his death. It's worth letting you know that the Japanese have a belief in something called Ketsueki Gata, especially in the 1970s, not so much today. The idea is that people have personality types based on blood types. It's kind of like a zodiac idea, pseudoscience. But there actually is documented discrimination historically against people with either B or AB blood types. They also believe that, for instance, people with AB blood are indecisive. And I have to admit, that does describe our main character, Yu Komori. The final two stories are actually pretty similar to what we've read before. In Witch of the Golden Eye, a beautiful new teacher at Yu's school causes a bunch of people to fall down the stairs and become injured, and then the boys become pretty crazy. We see that she has some sort of supernatural eyes, and Yu's powers help protect him. The folks in town begin going crazy. Yu encounters killer dogs. Even his friend Araki becomes angry. Yu thinks to wear his sunglasses to protect himself. The art does evolve a bit here. Things escalate into a student protest as everyone gets angrier and more jealous. The teacher proclaims that she doesn't want her abilities and it's not her fault, but then a soldier trying to keep the peace accidentally shoots her in the head and the story abruptly ends. The final story, The Woman Who Raises the Tiger, is another type of scorned woman with supernatural abilities, like the last chapter and the Winter Witch one. In this, a band is getting killed off one by an invisible tiger. Yu investigates and he finds out that a woman named Miki has superpowers which allow her to manifest a tiger aimed at those that she's mad at. Sure enough, the band had molested her and she gets her revenge. The president of the band's studio hires a killer to take out Mickey, which he does. But even while dead, the tiger emerges and kills him. Then, the arrogant studio president gets attacked by a tiger while on an airplane. It ends with you just contemplating what happened. For this adaptation of Spider-Man, I'm totally okay with the new character, the new setting, a totally different tone. But I do think it's a bit of a failure how eventually the creative team just sort of abandons the Spider-Man concept. There's very little of Spider-Man suiting up and being a hero. Yu Komori is an interesting character, but he'd be a lot more interesting with a supporting cast to bounce off of and interesting villains that have a more personal connection instead of him just bumping into them. For the final story, Yu is barely involved, and certainly not really involved as Spider-Man. He also didn't really suit up in the previous story. So, you know, despite what Ryoichi Ikegami said at one point about the story connecting with readers, the fact that this story ends so suddenly, you know, there's no end to Yu's story. It just ends. I think that does indicate that readers had lost interest and they just decided to cancel the series. In fact, Ikegami has said, quote, "We got all the way up to the 5th volume before the cultural differences sort of did us in." Kodansha did reprint the manga in tankobon volumes in 1976 and a few more times, with the last reprint being in 2004, over 20 years ago. But Marvel did decide to translate the manga into English and print it themselves in monthly periodical format in 1997. Translator and writer Kosei Ono explained in his retrospective of the manga that he did send several issues to Stan Lee, hoping that he would appreciate their version. Ono wrote about the exchange, saying, quote, "I got a letter back from Stan Lee. I thought he would be so happy to hold in his hands the Japanese Spider-Man. The pictures are utterly fantastic, but I have to tell you, the scene where the teenage girl is about to be by those young men, well, that kind of thing wouldn't happen in our comics. I feel this is something that makes your Spider-Man different from ours. If you ask me what I think of it, from my point of view, it seems we have different standards than you do there in Japan, so I don't think I know how to judge your version." So, it hadn't gone over too well with Marvel's editor-in-chief and co-creator of the character, but by the 90s, manga had become much more popular in America. In 1996, Marvel had declared bankruptcy and was trying new things to capture new readers. Would the story fare better over here with fans of both manga and Spider-Man? No, definitely not. The first issue started out selling just under 23,000 copies, when the top 10 books for that month all sold over 100,000 copies. It ended mid-story with issue 31, with 4 stories not adapted at all and 1 only partially adapted before the title was canceled. It was selling just over 2,000 copies for the final issue. Marvel would not print something with numbers that low today, but may have opted to keep this series going at the time because there was less overhead. They even tried to use the most popular artist of the day, Joe Madureira, on 2 of the covers, although it used the same artwork for both issues, just cropped differently. The stories were edited for violence and printed out of order. After the first 6 stories, Marvel skipped the story with Yu's drug dealer friend. Then, after Woman of Winter, they skipped the kidnapping story and the story where Rumi dies and went straight to the Shadow of Spider-Man's story. If things weren't selling well, I get why they bumped that one up in the order. It had been a long time since Spider-Man fought an actual supervillain. Then they jumped back to the kidnapping story, but canceled the title before it was finished. I think it's safe to say that readers weren't checking it out, but I don't necessarily think it was the dark stories themselves. For instance, if Marvel had collected it in tankobon volume, like they did in Japan, this format was popular in America by the 90s, and I think that that might have gone over well or hooked new readers or manga readers as compared to putting it out in the monthly periodical format. Also, Marvel did do that weird thing where they just flipped the artwork so that it would read right to left instead of left to right like manga does, but I think by 1997 a lot of people had figured out how to read manga properly. Still, this is a fascinating book for several reasons. First of all, while the Japanese manga version of Spider-Man is much darker and more depressing, it also touches on plenty of things Japan was interested in 1970. And I think with the growth of manga and anime, lots of readers today would find that an easy and engaging entry point into seeing those concerns. Delinquents, student protests, violent crime, important issues of the day. It's also a really interesting look at artist Ryoichi Ikegami before he became popular with books like My the Psychic Girl, Crying Freeman, Heat, Sanctuary, many more. This shows what manga, and more specifically Gekiga, was in the 70s. But there are hints at the soulful and well-rendered hatching that Ikegami would become best known for. I think we're also at a point where readers are very open to multiple interpretations of characters without being confused. The success of DC's Absolute books and Marvel's Ultimate titles are evidence of that. These days, both Marvel and DC have had successful adaptations of their characters to manga with Batman, Superman, Deadpool, and more. But someone had to try it first. The earliest attempts were the 1960s Batman stories, which also didn't succeed very well, and this fascinating interpretation of Spider-Man from 1970. If you want to read these for yourself, they haven't obviously all been translated into English, but I would say that the tankobon reprints are generally not too hard to find collected and shouldn't be too expensive. I got them several years ago in Japan for about $40, I think. That was a few years ago, and obviously they haven't been reprinted for over 20 years, so today a fair price, at a convention or online might be somewhere between $60 to $100. That's obviously up to you. Might be cheaper if you can find them in Japan at a used bookstore like Book Off or Mandarake. So obviously I gave you an overview of each of the stories. That said, I didn't show you everything, and the real reason to read these would really be to study the artwork by Ikegami. There's a lot to learn here about pacing. There's a lot that's fascinating if you like his comics, manga specifically, where you can see an evolution. This is an interesting early look at an artist. I don't think that most of these stories are necessarily that deep, but it's still such a different interpretation of Spider-Man that, at least as a novelty, it's a really interesting read. And I think it's more than a novelty, because I think that there are subplots that I didn't talk about, or extended action sequences that are fun to read, and I think that there are cultural touchstones that help us just sort of see how a different part of the world was perceiving world events and looking at their teenagers. I'm glad I have this. I'm really glad I read it. I do recommend it. It's just know going in that it is much more depressing than an American Spider-Man story. Anyway, I appreciate you joining me for this. Please remember to ask your comic book store, if at all possible, to order you a copy of Radiant Black number 32. And now I'm going to do the credits, and I'll tell you a little bit about the behind the scenes of making this episode. Thanks so much. I'll see you soon. Keep reading comics. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. I'm sorry that this one took a little longer to make than others, that there's been a gap between episodes. I've had a lot going on. My wife and I did take a trip to Japan, but it was cut very short because she ended up getting pretty sick. We had to go to the hospital there. It was pretty intense to figure out the logistics of getting home, of translating. You know, it was a pretty serious stuff. It wasn't just a cold or anything. It was pretty serious, but I won't go into that now. But obviously that takes some time. You know, going over this, I'd read this story, but it takes a while to read it because it's in Japanese, so it takes me a little longer. Also, I had a little more to say about this than a typical episode because I wanted to get into each story and talk about some of the differences from Japanese Spider-Man to American Spider-Man. For instance, a normal episode is maybe 4 to 5 pages for me, and this one was 12. That was my script length. So it's just taken me a little bit longer, and I appreciate you bearing with me. It was still a really fun one to do, but I had to read through these stories like several times because, you know, I had to read it, which was slow. I had to like make notations of which pages that I needed to scan. You know, a lot of this has just never been translated into English, but I do recommend it. I think it's pretty cool. I hope you got something out of watching a slightly different episode. And again, I'd appreciate it if you guys would ask your store to get you a copy of Radiant Black issue 32. Issue 31 is a fresh jumping on point for new readers or readers that have bailed. Issue 31 comes out at the end of February, and issue 32, March 26th. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you real soon.